The fog rolled in from the North Sea like the breath of something ancient and malevolent, swallowing the cliffs of Hollow Bridge whole. Daniel Keaton stood at the rusted gates of the industrial plant, his safety inspector, his clipboard already damp with moisture that seemed to seep through his bones. The year was 2003, and he'd come here to start over, to forget the mistakes that had cost him his marriage, his reputation, and nearly his sanity. The plant loomed before him like a metal beast, all corrugated walls, and towering smokestacks that disappeared into the gray morning mist. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the crash of waves against stone, but the sound was muffled, distorted by the fog until it resembled something else entirely, something like screaming. "You'll be Daniel Keaton, then?" The voice startled him from his thoughts. An elderly man emerged from the fog, his face weathered like driftwood, eyes the color of storm clouds. "I'm MacLeod. Been running things since your predecessor had his accident." Daniel had read the file. Thomas Morrison, 45, safety inspector for 3 years, found at the base of the cliffs, body broken on the rocks. The official report called it suicide, but Daniel had noticed the inconsistencies, the timing, the location. The fact that Morrison's final inspection reports had grown increasingly erratic in his last weeks. "What kind of accident?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he wouldn't get a straight answer. MacLeod's expression darkened, the kind that happens when a man stops following the rules. "Come on, I'll show you around. Best to get it done while there's still light." They walked through the facility in relative silence, past machinery that hummed with an almost organic rhythm. The plant processed chemical waste, had been doing so since the 1940s, MacLeod explained, though the nature of that waste had changed over the decades. During the Cold War, it had handled materials from the government's nuclear research programs, classified stuff, the kind of experiments that were better left buried. Of course, that was all shut down in the 70s, MacLeod said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "These days we just handle standard industrial waste. Nothing too dangerous." Daniel made notes as they toured the facility, cataloging safety violations and equipment malfunctions. The workers they passed seemed subdued, avoiding eye contact. Several bore unusual scars, pale raised marks that looked almost like brands. When Daniel asked about workplace injuries, MacLeod's answers were evasive. It wasn't until they reached the eastern wall of the plant that Daniel began to understand why his predecessor might have grown erratic in his final weeks. Here the building extended almost to the cliff's edge, and through a grimy window, Daniel could see down into the chasm below. The fog was thicker there, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. And in that fog, shapes moved, human-shaped but wrong, their movements too fluid, too purposeful. "Trick of the light," MacLeod said, noticing Daniel's stare. "The fog plays games with your eyes. Best not to look too long." That evening, MacLeod took Daniel to his quarters, a small trailer on the plant grounds. It was Spartan but functional, with a narrow bed, a desk, and a kitchenette. On the wall near the door, Daniel noticed 3 signs made of rusted metal. The words carved deep as if with desperate urgency. "Never look at T the cliffside. After dusk, never speak when you hear your name in the dark. Leave salt a tea every." "Doorway Morrison's work," MacLeod explained, his voice carefully neutral. Man became obsessed with superstition near the end, kept talking about the old stories, nonsense about things living in the cliffs. I'd have taken them down, but, well, they're harmless enough. And some of the older workers, they appreciate the reminders. Reminders of what? MacLeod was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window toward the fog-shrouded cliffs. The locals call them hollow men. Been stories about them for generations. Say they come up from the deep places when the fog rolls in. Nonsense, of course. But in a place like this, where the mist plays tricks and the wind sounds like voices, well, a man's imagination can get away from him. After MacLeod left, Daniel examined the signs more closely. The metal was old, corroded, but the words had been carved recently, the cuts still sharp, the metal bright where the tool had bitten through the rust. Morrison had made these in his final weeks, perhaps his final days. They weren't the work of a man descending into madness. They read like warnings, like rules for survival. Daniel's first week passed quietly enough. He conducted his inspections, filed his reports, and tried to ignore the way the workers watched him with a mixture of pity and resignation. The plant operated on 3 shifts, and Daniel had been assigned to cover all of them on a rotating basis. The night shift was the most unsettling. Skeleton crew, minimal lighting, and the constant presence of the fog pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. It was during his second night shift that Daniel first heard his name. He was inspecting the decompression tanks in the eastern section when it came, a voice drifting through the fog outside, clear despite the thick walls and double-paned windows. Daniel Keaton. The voice was familiar, though he couldn't place it at first. Then recognition struck him like a physical blow. It was Sarah's voice, his ex-wife, calling to him with the same tone she'd used during their last fight, when she had begged him to get help, to stop drinking, to save their marriage before it was too late. But Sarah was 300 miles away in Edinburgh, and she hadn't spoken his name with anything but contempt for over a year. Daniel moved toward the window, drawn by an impulse he couldn't explain. The fog seemed to part as he approached, revealing glimpses of the cliff face beyond. And there, standing at the very edge of the precipice, was a figure in Sarah's yellow raincoat, the one she'd worn during their last vacation together, before everything went wrong. His hand was on the window latch when he remembered the second rule carved into Morrison's signs. Never speak when you hear your name in the dark. Daniel's mouth was already open, Sarah's name forming on his lips, when he forced himself to stop. The figure at the cliff's edge turned toward him, and even through the fog and distance, he could see that its face was wrong. Not Sarah's face at all, but a smooth expanse of translucent skin, featureless except for 2 dark cavities where eyes should be. The thing that wasn't Sarah raised its hand in a wave that was mockingly familiar, then stepped backward into the fog and disappeared. Daniel stood frozen at the window for what felt like hours, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he finally moved away, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his clipboard. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen: stress, exhaustion, the power of suggestion combined with the disorienting effects of the fog. But deep down he knew better. The hollow men were real. The next morning, Daniel sought out the oldest worker he could find, a man named Angus who'd been at the plant for nearly 30 years. They met in the break room over bitter coffee, and Daniel asked about the stories, the legends, the truth behind Morrison's warnings. Angus was quiet for a long time, studying Daniel's face as if weighing his sincerity. Finally he spoke. My grandfather worked here during the war, told me stories about the government experiments, not just nuclear but other things, biological, chemical. They were trying to create something new, something that could survive what they thought was coming. The bombs, the radiation, the end of the world as we knew it. Angus paused, glancing around to make sure they were alone. The experiments failed, or so they claimed. But the waste, all that poison material had to go somewhere. They dumped it in the caves beneath the cliffs, sealed them up, thought that would be the end of it. But the tide pools, the groundwater, nature finds a way. You're talking about mutation, Daniel said. Genetic damage from radiation exposure. I'm talking about evolution, Angus corrected. Adaptation. The things living down there in the deep caves, they learn to survive in ways we never imagined. They learn to hunt, to mimic, to use our own memories and fears against us. The old-timers called them hollow men, because that's what they look like from a distance. Human-shaped but empty, translucent skin stretched over hollow bones. But up close, Angus shuddered. Up close, there's something else entirely. How do you know all this? Because I've seen them. We all have, those of us who've been here long enough. They come up when the fog rolls in, hunting for warmth, for life, for whatever it is they need to sustain themselves. Most of the time they stay near the cliffs, picking off the occasional tourist or drunk fisherman. But sometimes they get bolder. Aye, and when they do, people disappear. Workers vanish from their shifts. Night guards are found torn apart. And always, it happens to those who break the rules. Daniel thought about Morrison's signs, about the desperate urgency in those carved words. The rules work? They help. Salt burns them, though I don't know why. They can't cross a proper barrier of it. Looking at them directly seems to draw their attention, make them aggressive, and speaking to them. Angus shook his head. That's the worst mistake you can make. They feed on communication somehow, use your voice to learn about you, to become you. Morrison figured that out near the end, but by then it was too late. What happened to him? He tried to expose the truth, wrote reports, gathered evidence, planned to go to the authorities. The night before he was supposed to leave for Edinburgh, he disappeared. They found him on the rocks the next morning, but... Angus lowered his voice to a whisper. That wasn't Morrison they found. It looked like him, sounded like him when it screamed as it fell. But the real Morrison, he's still down there somewhere. Still alive, still screaming. You can hear him some nights when the fog is thickest. Daniel left the conversation with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. The danger at Hollow Bridge was real, immediate, and growing. That afternoon, he began his own investigation, poring over old records, maintenance logs, and incident reports dating back decades. The pattern was there once he knew how to look for it. Disappearances that coincided with heavy fog, workers found dead under impossible circumstances, safety inspectors who grew increasingly paranoid before suffering accidents. The plant's true purpose became clear as well. It wasn't just processing waste, it was containing it. The eastern section, where Daniel had seen the figure the night before, was built directly over one of the sealed cave entrances. The constant hum of machinery wasn't just for waste processing, it was a containment system using sound and vibration to keep something imprisoned below. But the seals were failing, had been failing for years. The toxic waste that had created the Hollow Men was seeping out, and they were growing stronger, more numerous, more daring in their hunts. Daniel's investigation was interrupted by an emergency on his 8th night at the plant. A decompression tank in the eastern section had developed a critical leak, venting toxic gas into the atmosphere. The night shift crew, 6 men in total, was trapped in the building, unable to evacuate due to the contamination. Daniel suited up in full protective gear and entered the plant with MacLeod and 2 other supervisors. The fog outside was thicker than he'd ever seen it, pressing against the windows like living smoke. Inside, the emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and the constant wail of alarms made communication nearly impossible. They found the first worker in the break room, slumped over a table as if he'd simply fallen asleep. But when MacLeod tried to wake him, the man's head lolled back to reveal a face that had been carved away, leaving only hollow sockets and smooth, translucent skin. "Jesus Christ," MacLeod whispered, stumbling backward. Before Daniel could respond, they heard a voice from the eastern corridor, one of the missing workers calling for help. But the voice was wrong, echoing strangely, as if it were coming from a great distance or from underwater. "Don't answer," Daniel said, remembering Morrison's rules. "Don't even listen." But MacLeod was already moving toward the sound, drawn by what seemed to be a colleague in distress. Daniel grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back, but the older man shrugged him off with surprising strength. "That's Jenkins," MacLeod said. "He's hurt. We have to help him." "That's not Jenkins," Daniel said, but MacLeod was already disappearing into the red-lit corridor. Daniel followed, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the alarms. The corridor led toward the eastern section, toward the windows that overlooked the cliffs. As they walked, the voice continued calling, sometimes Jenkins, sometimes other workers, sometimes people Daniel had never heard of, but always with that same hollow, echoing quality, as if the words were being spoken through water or from the bottom of a deep well. They found MacLeod standing at the large window that overlooked the cliff face, staring out into the fog. His body was rigid, unmoving, as if he'd been frozen in place. "MacLeod," Daniel called softly. "We need to go, now." But MacLeod didn't respond, and as Daniel moved closer, he could see why. The older man's face had gone blank, his eyes wide and unseeing. His mouth was open, but no sound came out, only a faint whistling, like air escaping from a punctured lung. Beyond the window, shapes moved in the fog, dozens of them, pressing close to the glass, their translucent forms barely visible in the red emergency lighting. They were human-shaped but wrong, too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at impossible angles. And their faces were smooth expanses of pale skin broken, only by dark cavities that seemed to lead into infinite depth. The Hollow Men had come up from the caves. One of them pressed its face against the window, and Daniel saw with sick fascination that its skin was indeed translucent. He could see the dark outline of a skull beneath, empty sockets where a brain should be. When it opened its mouth, no teeth were visible, only a black void that seemed to pull at Daniel's vision like a whirlpool. It spoke with MacLeod's voice. "Daniel, help me. They're inside. They're inside the building." Daniel forced himself to look away from the window, to focus on MacLeod's frozen form. The man was still breathing, but shallowly, as if he were in some kind of trance. Daniel grabbed his arm, tried to pull him away from the window, but MacLeod's feet remained planted as if rooted to the floor. "They're coming," the thing outside continued in MacLeod's voice. "Through the eastern entrance, through the old seal. Help me, Daniel. Help me fight them." But Daniel could see the truth now. The eastern entrance, the sealed cave mouth beneath the building, had been breached. Emergency lighting flickered in the lower levels, and through the grating in the floor, he could see movement in the tunnels below. The hollow men weren't just outside the building. They were inside, rising from the depths like smoke from a fire. A scream echoed through the corridors. One of the remaining workers. It was cut short with horrible abruptness. Daniel made his decision. He couldn't save MacLeod. The man was lost, trapped in whatever spell the creatures had cast over him. But he might be able to save himself and any other survivors. He ran back through the corridors, following his memory of the plant's layout toward the main entrance. He found the second worker in the processing room, backed against a wall and staring at something Daniel couldn't see. The man's eyes were wide with terror, his mouth working soundlessly. As Daniel approached, he could hear what the worker was hearing, voices calling from the darkness between the machines. Familiar voices, loved ones, family members who couldn't possibly be here. "Don't listen," Daniel shouted over the alarms. "Don't look at them. We have to get out." But the worker couldn't hear him, or wouldn't. He took a step toward the darkness between the machines, then another. Daniel grabbed his arm, tried to physically restrain him, but the man fought with desperate strength, clawing and kicking to reach whatever he thought he saw in the shadows. A shape emerged from the darkness, tall, thin, moving with that fluid, unnatural gait. It reached out with arms that were too long, fingers that tapered to translucent points, and embraced the struggling worker. The man's scream was cut off instantly, and when the shape stepped back into the shadows, he went with it, his feet dragging across the floor like a rag doll's. Daniel ran. He reached the main entrance to find the doors sealed, not locked, but somehow fused shut, as if the metal had been melted and reformed. The windows were the same, covered with a translucent film that reminded him horribly of the creature's skin. He was trapped inside with whatever had come up from the caves. The building's main power failed, plunging everything into darkness broken only by the pale emergency lighting. In that red-tinted gloom, Daniel could see them moving through the corridors, the hollow men, dozens of them, flowing like smoke between the machines and through the ventilation system. They moved in perfect silence, communicating through methods he couldn't comprehend, coordinating their hunt with predatory efficiency. One of them paused near his hiding spot behind an overturned desk, its eyeless face turning in his direction. Daniel held his breath, remembering Morrison's first rule, never look at the cliffside after dusk. But what about looking at them directly? Angus had said it drew their attention, made them aggressive. The creature's mouth opened, revealing that impossible black void, and it spoke with Daniel's own voice. Words he'd spoken to Sarah during their last fight, private words that no one else should know. "I never meant for it to happen this way. I loved you. I still love you. Please don't leave me." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the urge to respond, to engage, with the thing that was using his most painful memories against him. The creature continued speaking in his voice, recreating entire conversations, dredging up every mistake, every regret, every moment of weakness from his past. When he opened his eyes again, it was gone. Daniel made his way through the building like a ghost, avoiding the main corridors, staying in the shadows, trying to reach the eastern section where he'd last seen MacLeod. He had a theory, a desperate, half-formed plan that might be their only chance of survival. The plant's containment system was failing, allowing the creatures to escape from their underground prison. But if he could reverse the process, overload the system instead of containing it, the resulting explosion would collapse the eastern section, sealing the breached entrance and trapping the hollow men below. It would mean sacrificing the building, probably his own life, and any workers who might still be alive in the eastern section. But it might also save the town, prevent the creatures from spreading beyond Hollow Bridge. He found the control room on the second level, overlooking the main processing floor. The computers were still functional, running on backup power, displaying system diagnostics in glowing green text. Daniel's training as a safety inspector had taught him enough about industrial systems to understand what he was looking at. Pressure readings, containment protocols, emergency overrides. The eastern section's containment system was indeed failing, but not from age or neglect. Something was actively working to disable it, systematically bypassing safety protocols and opening sealed passages. The computer logs showed the changes happening in real time, as if invisible. Hands were working at other terminals throughout the building. Daniel realized with growing horror that the hollow men weren't just mindless predators. They were intelligent, organized, working together to free themselves from their underground prison. They'd been studying the facility for years, learning its systems, waiting for the right opportunity to act. Morrison's disappearance hadn't been random. It had been planned. The safety inspector had gotten too close to the truth, so they'd eliminated him and taken his place, using his identity to access the plant security systems and begin their escape. which meant MacLeod might not be MacLeod at all. Daniel's hands flew over the keyboard, accessing the emergency protocols, bypassing safety systems, redirecting power from the containment fields to the processing equipment. If he could overload the eastern section's machinery, create a feedback loop that would build to catastrophic failure. That's not going to work. Daniel spun around to find MacLeod standing in the doorway, his face calm, his eyes reflecting the computer screen's green glow. But something was wrong with his reflection. It showed not MacLeod's weathered features, but smooth, translucent skin and hollow sockets where eyes should be. "You're not MacLeod," Daniel said, his fingers still working at the keyboard behind him. "I am now," the thing replied in MacLeod's voice. "I have his memories, his mannerisms, his knowledge of this facility. In every way that matters, I am MacLeod." Just as Morrison is still Morrison, down in the deep places where he screams. What do you want? To live, to grow, to spread beyond this miserable place and find new hunting grounds. Your kind has poisoned the world, Daniel Keaton. You've filled it with chemicals and radiation, created perfect conditions for our evolution. We're not the monsters here. We're the future. The thing that wore MacLeod's face stepped into the room, its movements too fluid, too controlled. "You can't stop us. The seals are already broken. The barriers are falling. Within hours, we'll have access to the surface world, and after that..." Daniel pressed the final key sequence, initiating the overload protocol. Alarms began screaming throughout the building as every piece of machinery in the eastern section began drawing maximum power simultaneously. "After that, you'll be dead," Daniel said. The creature's calm expression never changed, but when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that didn't belong to any human throat. "You'll die with us. The explosion will bring down the entire building. I know. And the other workers, the ones still alive down there, you'll kill them too." Daniel felt the weight of that decision, the knowledge that he was condemning innocent people to save a town that might not even believe the threat was real. But the alternative was worse, letting these creatures loose on an unsuspecting world. "I know," he repeated. The building shook as the first pieces of equipment began to fail, their safeguards overwhelmed by the massive power surge Daniel had initiated. Through the control room's windows, he could see the hollow men in the processing area below, their translucent forms becoming agitated, moving with increasing urgency as they realized what was happening. The creature wearing MacLeod's face lunged at him with inhuman speed, its fingers extended like claws, its mouth opening to reveal that infinite black void. Daniel threw himself sideways, crashing into a bank of monitors, feeling glass cut into his back as the screens exploded in showers of sparks. The thing landed where he'd been standing, its feet somehow finding purchase on the smooth floor despite their impossible anatomy. It turned toward him with predatory grace, and Daniel could see its true form now. The translucent skin was cracking, revealing something underneath that was neither human nor entirely alien, but a twisted fusion of both. "You don't understand," it said, still using MacLeod's voice even as its face began to change, features flowing like wax. "We're not destroying humanity. We're perfecting it. Evolution doesn't stop, Daniel. It can't stop, and when the poison you've pumped into this world finally makes the surface uninhabitable, we'll be the only ones left to inherit it." The building shook again, more violently this time. In the distance, Daniel could hear the groaning of overstressed metal, the whine of turbines spinning beyond their design limits. The overload was working, but it would take time he might not have. He grabbed a broken piece of monitor casing, its edge sharp with fractured glass, and swung it at the creature. The improvised weapon passed through its translucent skin without resistance, like cutting through smoke, but the creature recoiled as if burned. Salt, Daniel remembered. Angus had said salt burned them. He scrambled toward the break room, adjacent to the control room, the creature following with that horrible fluid grace. In the small kitchen area, Daniel found what he was looking for. A large container of rock salt used for the facility's water softening system. He grabbed handfuls of the crystalline substance, flinging it at the approaching creature. The effect was immediate and devastating. Where the salt touched the thing's translucent skin, it began to smoke and dissolve, revealing the hollow bone structure beneath. The creature's scream was like nothing Daniel had ever heard, not sound so much as vibration, a frequency that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. It retreated, its form becoming less stable, more obviously inhuman. Other hollow men were gathering in the corridors outside, drawn by their companions' distress, but none of them entered the break room. They couldn't cross the barrier of salt Daniel had scattered across the threshold. The building shook again, and this time the lights went out completely, leaving only the eerie phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the creatures themselves. In that ghostly illumination, Daniel could see the structural damage beginning, cracks spreading. Across the walls, ceiling tiles falling as support beams twisted under impossible stress. His plan was working, but too slowly. The eastern section was overloading, but the feedback was spreading throughout the building's systems, threatening to destroy the western sections before the crucial eastern containment area could collapse. Daniel looked at the control panel one last time, at the readings that showed pressures building beyond any safe threshold. There was one more option, a manual override that would redirect all available power to the eastern section's primary processing unit. It would cause an immediate catastrophic failure, but it would also require someone to physically activate the override switch in the eastern section itself, a suicide mission. The hollow men seemed to sense his decision. They pressed closer to the break room's entrance, their eyeless faces turned toward him with predatory hunger. The one wearing MacLeod's deteriorating features spoke from the corridor. "You can't save them, Daniel. Even if you destroy this facility, there are others, dozens of places where your government conducted experiments, where waste was buried, where evolution has continued in the darkness. We are not unique to Hollow Bridge. We are everywhere, waiting." Daniel ignored the creature's words, focusing on the emergency protocols displayed on his tablet's screen. The manual override was located in sub-level 3 of the eastern section, directly above the breached cave system where the creatures had first emerged. Getting there would mean crossing through the heart of their territory, but it was the only way. He gathered more salt from the kitchen, stuffing his pockets with the crystalline substance, then grabbed a flare from the emergency supplies. The creatures hissed and withdrew as the red light flared to life, their translucent forms seeming to diminish in its glow. The journey through the building was a nightmare of shadows and whispers. The hollow men followed him through the corridors, but kept their distance. Apparently unable or unwilling to approach the flare's harsh light, they spoke constantly in stolen voices, his ex-wife, his father, colleagues from his previous job, childhood friends whose names he'd forgotten until they spoke them from eyeless mouths. "Danny, come play with us," they called in the voice of his sister, who died in a car accident when they were teenagers. "We've been waiting for you down in the dark places. Don't go, son." His father's voice pleaded from a creature pressed against the ceiling like a translucent spider. "You don't have to die for strangers. Come home. Your mother misses you." But Daniel had learned Morrison's lessons well. He didn't answer, didn't look directly at any of them, focused only on reaching the eastern section's lower levels. The building continued to shake and groan around him, pieces of machinery failing in. Cascading sequence as his overload protocols spread through the facility's systems. Sub-level 3 was flooded, not with water, but with a thick phosphorescent mist that seemed to move with its own volition. Daniel's flare cut through it like a knife, revealing glimpses of the manual override station 20 feet away. The switch was housed in a reinforced booth built to withstand industrial accidents, but the booth was surrounded by dozens of hollow men. They stood motionless in the mist, their translucent forms barely visible until the flare's light touched them. Then they became more solid, more real, as if the light itself was feeding them substance. Daniel realized with sick understanding that they weren't trying to stop him. They were waiting for him to approach, to enter their domain willingly. The building shook violently, and Daniel heard the distant sound of structural collapse. The eastern section's upper levels were beginning to fail, but not quickly enough. The creatures were already spreading throughout the facility, finding ways to the surface, beginning their escape into the wider world. Daniel stepped into the mist. The hollow men moved aside to let him pass, forming a corridor of watching forms that led directly to the override station. They didn't attack, didn't speak, just watched with their eyeless faces as he walked toward what he knew would be his death. The manual override was exactly where the schematics indicated, a large red switch protected by a clear plastic cover. Daniel lifted the cover and placed his hand on the switch, feeling the vibration of massive electrical systems through the metal handle. "You cannot stop evolution," a voice said behind him. Daniel turned to see a figure in the mist, human-shaped but wrong, its face a smooth expanse of translucent skin broken only by that terrible hollow mouth. When it spoke, it used Daniel's own voice, but older, changed by decades of screaming. "I tried to stop them too, but they never die. They never stop. They only multiply." Daniel realized he was looking at Morrison, or what Morrison had become after his disappearance. The real safety inspector, twisted and changed by whatever the creatures had done to him in the deep places beneath the cliffs. "How long?" Daniel asked, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. "Years," Morrison replied in Daniel's voice. "They kept me alive to learn from me, to understand human behavior, human weaknesses. Everything they know about your kind, they learned from my screams. I'm sorry, don't be sorry, just remember the rules. Never look at the cliffside after dusk. Never speak when you hear your name in the dark. Leave salt at every doorway." Morrison's twisted form stepped closer. "And when you join us down here, try to remember who you were before. It's the only thing that makes the eternity bearable." Daniel threw the switch. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every piece of electrical equipment in the eastern section overloaded simultaneously, transforming the lower levels into a hell of sparks and molten metal. The hollow men screamed, not with stolen voices, but with sounds that belonged to no earthly creature, harmonics. That shattered what remained of the building's windows and sent cracks racing through the bedrock itself. The mist ignited, burning with a phosphorescent flame that revealed the true scope of the creature's presence. They weren't dozens, they were hundreds, maybe thousands, filling every corner of the underground complex like a colony of luminous insects. And as the flames consumed them, they began to change, their translucent forms becoming more solid, more human, as if death was somehow transforming them back into what they'd once been. Daniel saw Morrison one last time as the man he'd been, middle-aged, balding, wearing a safety inspector's jacket that read Thomas Morrison in faded letters. The man's eyes were clear and grateful as the flames took him. Then the eastern section collapsed. Daniel felt the floor give way beneath him, felt himself falling through burning air, toward the deep places where the original experiments had been conducted decades ago. Above him, the building's superstructure twisted and fell, sealing the breach, crushing the caves and tunnels, where humanity's attempts to transcend nature had given birth to something that transcended humanity itself. His last coherent thought was a prayer that his sacrifice had been enough, that the creature's spread had been contained, that the town of Hollow Bridge would wake tomorrow to find only ruins and fog where the industrial plant had stood. But as consciousness faded, he heard something that filled him with despair, voices calling. From other parts of the collapsing building, human voices speaking in fear and confusion. The night shift workers from other sections, people who had nothing to do with the containment breach, who had simply been in the wrong place when evolution decided to take a new turn. Their voices joined his as the darkness claimed them all, and in that darkness something vast and patient began to stir. The hollow men of Hollow Bridge were gone, burned away by fire and buried under tons of rubble. But they had been right about one thing. Evolution doesn't stop, and in a world poisoned by decades of industrial waste and radioactive experimentation, there were countless other places where similar transformations might already be underway. Places where the barriers between human and inhuman grew thinner with each passing year, where survival meant adapting to conditions that would have been impossible to imagine just generations ago. The fog rolled in from the North Sea that night, thicker than anyone in Hollow Bridge could remember. It swallowed the collapsed remains of the industrial plant, then spread inland toward the town proper, carrying with it the faint sound of voices calling names that nobody recognized. Names in a language that might once have been human, but had evolved beyond recognition, beyond understanding, beyond hope of redemption. By morning, the fog had lifted, leaving only silence and the distant crash of waves against stone. The ruins of the plant were already being reclaimed by nature, covered in a phosphorescent moss that grew with unnatural speed. The official report would blame a gas leak, an industrial accident, a tragic but ultimately explainable event. But the survivors, those few who had been far enough from the plant to escape the collapse, knew better. They understood that some hungers cannot be contained, some evolutionary pressures cannot be stopped, and some rules exist for reasons that become clear only after they've been broken. 3 metal signs were found in the ruins, their words still legible despite the fire and destruction. Never look at the cliffside after dusk, never speak when you hear your name. In the dark, leave salt at every doorway. The signs were moved to the town museum, displayed as curiosities from a simpler time when people believed in folklore and superstition. But on foggy nights, when the mist rolls in thick from the North Sea, the older residents of Hollow Bridge still follow Morrison's rules. They keep salt by their doorways, avoid looking toward the cliffs after dark, and when they hear familiar voices calling from the fog, they close their windows and pretend not to listen. Because some lessons are learned only once, and the price of forgetting is always paid in. screams that echo from places deeper and darker than any human voice was meant to reach. The industrial plant was never rebuilt. The land was sealed by government order, declared too contaminated for development, too dangerous for human habitation. Official records listed it as a standard environmental cleanup site, but the workers who came to install the barriers and warning signs often reported strange experiences, voices, in languages they didn't recognize, shadows that moved against the light, and a persistent feeling that they were being watched by eyes that reflected no light at all. Years passed. The town of Hollow Bridge slowly recovered, finding new industries, new reasons for tourists to visit their fog-shrouded coastline. The story of the industrial disaster became local legend, told in pubs on winter nights, when the wind howled off the water and made the windows rattle in their frames. But sometimes, on the thickest fog nights, when visibility dropped to mere feet and the sound of the waves seemed to come from impossible directions, people still disappeared. Not many, 1 or 2 a year, usually strangers who hadn't learned the rules, who walked too close to the sealed section of coastline or answered voices that called to them from the mist. The official explanations were always reasonable: accidental drowning, people lost in the fog, who fell from the cliffs, tragic mishaps that could have been prevented with proper caution. But the bodies, when they were found, told a different story. They were always discovered inland, far from the water, with expressions of recognition frozen on their faces, as if they had seen someone they knew in their final moments, someone they had trusted completely. And in the deeper parts of the sea, where the currents carried debris from the collapsed plant, out into the vast darkness of the Atlantic, fishermen sometimes report catching things that don't belong in any textbook, translucent creatures that pulse with their own phosphorescent light, calling out in voices that sound almost human as they're hauled up from the depths. The smart fishermen throw them back immediately, crossing themselves and muttering old prayers their grandmothers taught them. But the curious ones, the ones who try to study their catch, to photograph it or bring it to shore, well, they learn soon enough why some rules exist, and why the price of evolution is always paid by those who think they can control forces older and hungrier than human understanding can encompass. Daniel Keaton's body was never found. Neither were the remains of Morrison, MacLeod, or any of the night shift workers who vanished with the eastern section's collapse. The official casualty report listed them as presumed dead, victims of industrial accident, their families compensated, and their names added to a memorial plaque that was installed at the harbor. But on certain foggy nights, when conditions are just right and the mist carries sounds from places that shouldn't exist, residents of Hollow Bridge report hearing voices from the ruins, voices that call out warnings in familiar tones, telling people to stay away from the cliffs, to keep salt nearby, to never trust the sounds that come from the deep places where evolution has taken paths that humanity was never meant to follow. The voices fade with the dawn, leaving only silence and the eternal crash of waves against stone. But the warnings remain, carved not in rusted metal signs but in the collective memory of a town that learned too late that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed. And in laboratories and industrial sites around the world, in places where governments once conducted experiments that were classified beyond the reach of oversight or conscience, similar transformations continue in darkness and secrecy. Evolution doesn't stop for human comfort or human rules. It adapts, it changes, it finds ways to survive in conditions that would kill ordinary life. The Hollow Men of Hollow Bridge were just the beginning, a single note in a symphony of transformation that plays out wherever. Humanity's poisoned legacy has seeped deep enough into the earth to reach things that were never meant to taste the light. And sometimes, on the foggiest nights, when the boundary between the possible and impossible grows thin as mist, those things come up from the deep places to hunt, to feed, to remind the world above that evolution's greatest trick is making predators that look exactly like their prey. The rules still apply. They always will. Never look at the cliffside after dusk. Never speak when you hear your name in the dark. Leave salt at every doorway, because some hungers are older than civilization, and some prices are paid not just by the living, but by the dead who refuse to stay buried in the poisoned earth where humanity's greatest mistakes continue to grow and change and wait for their chance to inherit a world that their creators can no longer control. The fog rolls in from the North Sea every night, and every night, something in that fog calls out in voices that sound like home, but the wise ones know better than to answer.